If you ask anybody about Jesus of Nazareth, they're going to say, oh, yeah, that's the Christ. Oh, yeah, Son of God, some people will say. What's he known for? Really good moral teacher, some will say. Others will say, oh, he's known for doing miracles. And I think everybody would say, oh, yeah, he's known for doing miracles. Now, some people think that's all mythology, that he never did that. Those stories grew over time. But most of us who follow the Bible, I will say all of us who follow the Bible, would say, oh, no, he really did those things. That's actual truth. The question isn't whether or not he did those. The questions we wrestle with is, what does it have to do with me? What is he trying to teach me? What is he trying to say to me about my life, my times, and the world in which I live 2,000 years later? If you were to look at the miracles of Jesus, I don't know if you asked anybody and said, well, name some that you had heard of. People might say, oh, raising the dead's a good one. Yeah. Hey, water into wine, that's a good one. Oh, yeah. Walking on water. We even have a phrase we say in America, like, oh, that guy thinks he walks on water, meaning he's holy and righteous and better than everybody else. How about you're opening the eyes of the blind or the healing the sick or the lame? Yeah, we might name those. How about the time Jesus fed at least 5,000 men, including women and children on top of that, with one little boy's sack lunch? I want to look at that today in which is one of a series called Seven Great Miracles of Jesus. I know he did more than that, but I'm going to look at least seven of them. And this one I'll call Dinner for 5,000 Without Reservations. Let's take a look, shall we? All right. So I know that when we look at these stories of Jesus, especially this one, I often wonder, is this just a little kiddie story? Is this like a Sunday school story? And then it just sort of dies and ends. I mean, Jesus did this, but what does it really mean? What was going on for all of us that we should think about? Because it isn't like what Jesus was trying to teach us is, hey, if you become a Christian, don't worry. You are always going to have a boatload of top ramen in your cupboards with canned sardines. It'll never end. It isn't like he was promising that. Things weren't, he was doing something. It was almost a one-off. He does a similar miracle later on another side of the Sea of Galilee, and it's with a different crowd of people. But really, this is not a typical thing that he does. This is a rather rare miracle, actually. And so when he does it, what is he trying to say to all of us? And I know there's some stuff in there that I could look at and say, oh, clearly you could compare the manna in the wilderness that the Hebrew children ate for 40 years. Every day God supplied their need. And here's Jesus coming on the scene and he's saying, hey, do you get the connection? I'm supplying you bread. Are you getting that? The connection of your daily living is going to be on me. So there is definitely a connection there. And then there's stuff about, well, his compassion, his understanding of our physical needs and not just spiritual, intellectual talk, but actually cares about what's going on with us physically and how our lives matter. And in addition to that, what you have is that these miracles that you see oftentimes are not mentioned in all four of the gospels. They might be mentioned in the first three called the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is actually kind of outside a little bit different, written later. And so if all four gospels say this, of all the things Jesus did, this is a super important thing, and all four are going to mention it, it means it's one we ought to probably really pay attention to and say, what is he trying to say to all of us that we're not quite getting? So let's take a look at the story. If you read it, you can find it in Matthew chapter 14. You can find it in Mark chapter 6. You can find it in Luke chapter 9 and John chapter 6. And I'm not going to read all four of those, but let's take a look. I've got my handy dandy New King James Bible right here. And I want to look at least at the Mark one and at the John one. So listen to the story. It says, then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves. But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. And when the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, this is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away, that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. But he answered and he said to them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? But he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks, in hundreds and in fifties. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. Let's take a look at the John 6 passage and read the same account from John's version, because he has some details in it that Matthew, Mark, and Luke didn't have. So John chapter 6, verse 1. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountains, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. And Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. And one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many?" And then Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in a place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to his disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost." Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world." Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Okay, so there's at least 2 of the 4 passages told in the Gospels. So let's look at this and backtrack a little bit and sort of set the scene of when and where and how this story takes place and what has been going on. So when we read it, we know that what has happened, if you backtrack and read it a little ahead of these passages, you would see that the apostles had been sent out in 2 by 2, that he had divided them into 2 groups, and like, you 3 go that way, you 3 go that way, spread out, and you're going to go throughout the town, going to all the towns, all of the villages, and there you're going to perform miracles, you're going to cast out demons, you're going to heal the sick, you're going to preach in my name, you're going to relay the message I have taught you to everybody else around. And so they go out, and for weeks, this is the journey they're on. We don't really know how long this took, but it was many days. And as they traveled, they didn't take anything with them. They just relied on the generosity of the people that were there. So they've been walking and hiking and performing miracles and teaching and doing this. And weeks later, they come back to Jesus, and they're telling Jesus everything that transpired. And they're super excited about like all the teaching that we did and all the miracles that we saw. But at the same time, they're sort of physically drained because it's been a long few weeks and they've hiked many miles. Right at that exact same time, backtracking, and Jesus gets word that his cousin John the Baptist has been beheaded. And when Jesus gets word of that, the grief and the sorrow hit him. So you have this strange combination of excitement and enthusiasm with tiredness, but grief and sorrow that John's been beheaded. Word gets to Jesus. He gathers his apostles around. He says to the 12 guys, he says, why don't we just get away? I mean, they've been inundated by so many crowds and so many people coming and so many miracles wanted that they're exhausted. In fact, we learned from Mark, they don't even have time to eat. And so unprepared and without any plans at all, they load up in a boat to get away from the crowds, to go somewhere else where they can just have some downtime with each other. And they're heading across the Sea of Galilee, which is about 4 miles across. And as they're rowing across and trying to get there in a strong headwind, it wouldn't take a lot of time. But if you were to hike it, walk it, it'd be about 10 miles around. The people see that he's heading across the lake, and they're like, well, let's just follow the lake around and watch where he puts to shore. So hundreds of them start following the shoreline. It's 10 miles, but they're hiking, they're making it pretty good, and they're watching until Jesus finally puts into shore, and there they are catching up to him. And for the rest of the day, the crowd just keeps gathering and gathering. So this idea that Jesus had of let's spend some lone time with each other, just some downtime to kind of refresh, recharge our own batteries. Let me talk to you guys in private. That's shot. And all these people have arrived, and then the crowd just keeps growing all day long. And we learn reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke that Jesus is doing miracles and teaching. That's what he's doing all day long. He's healing people, performing some miracles for them, not like sideshow magic tricks, but usually meeting deep needs that people have of, setting people free of bondages and taking care of physical ailments. And then he teaches a while, and then a new group shows up. He does some more miracles. He teaches a while. And this goes on all day. Well, the disciples are pulling aside and just sort of sitting back and watching it. And I got to wonder, like, are they resentful? I mean, what are they thinking? Are they like exhausted with this? Are they like, this was our time with Jesus and you guys are screwing it up for us? You just incessant crowd will not stop coming. And I got to wonder how they're feeling about it. At the same time, they watch what Jesus is doing. They're like, this is what he does. It's his thing. Let him go. And as the day starts to wind down, they look up and they're like, this isn't going to go well. We're out here. We set out for what was the scripture tells a lonely place. It was a territory under the control of the city of Bethsaida, but it was like way out in the far reaches. It was like the backwoods country. These are the back roads. He's out in the backwoods and the back roads in the country where there's no villages, no towns, nothing of any significance around him. And he's on this hillside and he's teaching, and at least 5,000 men show up. So if you add women and children, there's probably a crowd of 10,000 people that have gathered by the end of the day. And suddenly the disciples are starting to look at this and they're going, this isn't going to turn out good. This day is long spent and there is nothing around us, and nobody prepared for this. We weren't prepared because this was a spontaneous decision. The crowd jumping in us, they weren't prepared. It's not like they packed a backpack and came here. Everybody's like, we don't have blankets to spend the night. We don't have food to eat. And that's the big deal. Food to eat is going to be, everybody's got to be hungry by now. I know we are. The disciples didn't even have time to eat before they left. And so here they are, and they're like, you need this, Jesus. So we're starting to look at this crowd and we're seeing this problem brewing. And there's this physical need that needs to happen, and you need to send the crowd away. And Jesus had looked up at them earlier, and it says that he saw them as sheep without a shepherd, so he had compassion on them. And that's an interesting phrase. It means he saw them as people who have no guidance. There's nobody guiding them. He looked at them and he said, there's no protection for these people. Nobody's protecting them. Nobody's guiding them. There's no personal care. There's no attendance. These are people who are really just like, they're just wild in the wilderness, getting caught in brambles, getting injured. Wolves are devouring them, and no one's guiding or protecting them or caring for them. And that needs to happen. And so out of his compassion and seeing their hunger and seeing their need, Jesus is like, we need to take care of this. And so he pulls his apostles beside, or when they get together, they say, hey, we need Jesus, send these people away. Jesus is like, well, why don't you guys take care of this problem? They're looking at each other like, us? Us? You want us to do something about this? I mean, we got nothing, Jesus. And they even speak up. It's like Philip, he says to Philip, why don't you tell them where they can get something to eat? Now, he says this to Philip because Philip is from that region. And in John, it says he said this to test him. What Jesus is doing is he's setting the scene for everybody around, because Philip from that territory knows where they could get stuff, where the villages are, where the towns are, where marketplaces might be. And even Philip has to say, I'm from this region and nowhere. Lord, we are in the middle of nowhere. There's nowhere we can send these people. So this is it. We're stuck here. And so Jesus is saying, well, you guys give them something to eat. And they're like, us? We got nothing. And in fact, their nothing was nothing. They finally come up with 5 loaves and 2 barley fish that aren't even theirs. They belong to some little kid who happened to be standing there talking to Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. And as many times as I've read this story, I can never get Andrew. He doesn't make any sense to me. It's like they're asking, well, what have you got? What do you have? And they're all like looking in their baskets. We got nothing. I got nothing. I packed nothing. Peter, you bring anything? No. How about you, John? Man, I didn't even have time to eat before we left. I'm hungry now. And so they're having this little dialogue. And here's Andrew, and he's like, well, I got this kid here. He's got 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And I think everybody just turns and looks at him like, you're a doofus, right? What? What did you just say? Look at this crowd. There are 10,000 people, because he finishes his statement and he says, yeah, but what's that with so many? I mean, that's not even enough for the kid, let alone the disciples, let alone the crowd. But then he's like saying, but this is all we have. He's saying to Jesus, all I got is next to nothing. And the next to nothing ain't even mine. Some kid brought this. He's willing to give it up. And so they take it to Jesus. He says, bring it over here. So they take it to Jesus. And this interesting phrase, Jesus says, have everybody sit down in groups. Now, the word groups that's used there, it's a Greek word that means like a vegetable garden. So it's a word that means rows and ranks and files. It's a very organized sit down. It's not just clusters of people. And we know that when we read it, it says in groups of 50 to 100. So somewhere between this pile of 50, 65 people over there, 100 over there, and there are all these groups. Now, if there's 10,000 people, that means there's at least 100 to 150 groups that are gathered. And there's only 12 disciples, so there's more than one group per disciple. And so Jesus sits them in these rows and ranks and files, and then he takes this bread, he breaks it, and he gives thanks. It's an interesting word there. It's where we get the phrase Eucharist. He gives thanks. And then he passes it to the apostles, and the apostles in turn take it, and they take it to these groups, and they do these rows. Now you think about the logistics of this. Now they had said earlier, they had said, there's no way we can afford anything like 200 denarii wouldn't even be enough. I mean, that'd be about $20,000, $30,000. They were like, there is not enough. Even if we had $20,000 or $30,000, we couldn't buy lunch for all these people in order to each of them have just a little bit. And now they've got these 5 loaves and these 5 barley loaves, these 2 fish, and this is all they got. And Jesus is saying, I'm going to pass this to you, and you're going to give it out. And you can imagine their reaction be like, is he kidding me? All right. What? I mean, how do we, if 30 grand wouldn't even buy a bite or 2 for each person, what's this going to do? But faithful to Jesus, they just like, okay, I don't know. It makes no sense to me either. Let's just do what Jesus is saying. And so he passes it out to them. And they, in turn, you think about the logistics now. There's groups of 150 groups. If you're going to get people to eat in any kind of timely fashion, they can't be doing this by themselves. They've got to be I'm handing a piece of bread to this guy, and he passes it on, and it gets passed on. And maybe this row of people has a leader, and they're going to pass it on. And this one, and how it's going to work, it's going to have to be a lot. Everybody is going to have to participate in order for this to really work. Now, I've read stuff where some people say this wasn't a miracle at all. All that happened is Jesus, brought this lunch and he began to pass it out. And then everybody pulled out their own lunch and started eating and shared it with everybody else, right? But clearly that's not what the story is saying. The story is clearly saying that he starts with, 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. That wasn't even enough to feed his 12, let alone everybody else. And the interesting thing is when you read the Gospel of John, at the end of John in verse 15, they're like, we saw a sign, meaning a miraculous thing just took place. They are so overwhelmed with this sign, they plan to come take Jesus and make him king by force because they saw a miracle. In fact, if you were to read on in the rest of John, in John chapter 6, and you read on, it says on the following day when the people were standing on the other side of the sea and saw that there was no other boat there except the one which his disciples had entered, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with the disciples this the following day. I'll skip down to verse 24. When the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they also got in the boats and came to Capernaum seeking Jesus. And when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said, Rabbi, when did you come here? And Jesus answered and said, most assuredly, I say to you, you seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him. And then they said, well, what must we do to do the works of God? And Jesus answered and said to them, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent. And therefore they said to him, well, what sign will you perform then that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do? Our fathers ate manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. So you can see that their reaction when they show up with Jesus is like, they're no longer now following Jesus to hear his teaching. They're like, we got free food from this guy. It was a miracle. And it's the next day, and they want him to repeat the miracle again. And he says, when they're asking for a sign, they're like, well, our fathers got manna from heaven. This is day 2. Where's the free food? They saw it as a miracle. They knew that they didn't produce their own lunches and their own fish and their own loaves. They knew a miracle had been done, and now they want that miracle repeated. And here's Jesus trying to say, look, the work you need to do is not chase after me for what I give you in food, but you need to chase after me because the teaching I'm giving you are the words of eternal life. And so this is all going on. So they knew it was a miracle, and this has all been happening. And I really wish one of the four gospel writers would have given us the mechanics. How did this miracle actually take place? It's kind of weird because none of them bother to say this is how it happened. All it says is he gave thanks in like a Eucharist fashion. He distributed to the 12. The 12 took it and then they gave it out and it just kept increasing. I know that in their custom in their day, we would carry backpacks. That would be our cultural thing to do. But they would have like a woven basket of some kind. They would all have a little basket that they would carry their stuff in, and it would pack your lunches and it would keep your extra change of underwear or whatever. You know, you would have all that stuff in a basket that you hiked around with you. It'd be an over the. And I don't know if what he did is like when he gave it to them, he put it in the basket and then they would reach in their basket and pull something out and they would reach in them, and as long as they did this, it was a never ending supply. And then when they passed it on, they went to a group and they're like, okay, there's 100 people here, there's 10 rows, and we're going to give to each of you, each leader of each row, starting to put it in their basket, and then they kept. Or did they like pass out the loaf and you got a piece of bread, and as you held it in your hand, it just kept increasing and growing, and as much as you tore it off, it kept being replaced? Did the fish do that? As much as you tore off, it would be replaced. And so you just have this small piece of fish in your hand, but every time you tore it off, it multiplied, whoop, it pulled up, whoop, it kept growing. How did this happen? None of the gospels will tell us the mechanics of how this miracle went down. Kind of bums me. But the same token, I get it because Jesus is like, it's not the mechanics of the miracle that count. It's the point I was making. It's what was Jesus teaching us in our time. And when they're all said and done, they go around and they start with the 5 loaves of the 2 fish. And when it's done, they have 12 basketfuls left over. And I know one word said fragments in the English translation, but if you go back and look in the Greek, it doesn't mean here's a half-eaten piece of fish. Anybody want it? It meant no, there was like full piece leftovers. There was what was left over was like, well, there's tons of bread, whole bread left, tons of fish left, and they filled 12 baskets full, ironically and incidentally and not coincidentally, one for each of the 12 disciples who had started the day with nothing, not even time to eat. And now each of them walks away with a basket full of supplies that they'll need for the next phase of their following Jesus. What's going on here? What is Jesus saying to us? What is he teaching in this? I think it's fascinating and interesting. I've looked at this study and I've gone and I've studied a bunch of different books and I've watched some YouTube channels and I'll get off on these things of people talking about, oh, the Hebrew numbers are huge because Hebrew and Greek they don't have a numeric system. The first letter is also the number 1. The second letter is number 2. And I've gone off, what does 5 loaves mean? What do 2 fish mean? What do 12 basketfuls left over? And I've watched for hours, watch these things and decided all of that, trying to interpret this passage is nonsense. None of it really. It's all wild guesswork comparing things that have nothing to do with each other in the Bible. The 5 loaves are like the 5 stones from King David and Goliath. It's like, no, they got nothing to do with each other. That's not the point at all. That's all hogwash. But I do know, when I read through the scriptures, I do know that there are times when Jesus does physical things that have spiritual lessons. He'll do something in the physical world that has a profound spiritual lesson. For instance, the 10 plagues of Egypt, those were physical plagues that happened, but they were also spiritually attacks against each of the Egyptian gods. I've done a whole sermon series on looking at what was the attack on the Egyptian god and what was God saying about himself as he did each of these. I know that when you read the Old Testament prophets, there would be signs like the prophet Isaiah would have a child, and that child was assigned to the king, that before this child's old enough to know right from wrong or good from evil, the empire you're afraid of is out there to attack you is going to be gone, right? There's those kinds of things. You have Ezekiel, who's like, he has signs that he does all sorts of crazy things God has him do. They're physical signs teaching spiritual truth. So I'm wondering, I do believe unequivocally, this is a miraculous thing that happens. But there's also what's the sign that Jesus is saying? What is he teaching us? Because in the modern times, like I began, we're not doesn't mean that every time you open your cupboard, you got free food going and you'll never have to worry about eating. That's not what this is teaching because that's not what we experience. And even for Jesus, this was a very rare, this is a two-time only miracle that he'll do. He'll heal a lot of blind people. He will heal a lot of lame people. He'll open the ears of a lot of deaf people. He'll deliver a lot of people from demons. But he only does this one twice. So, what is he saying to us as we look at this whole thing? And I have to reflect and sit back and I'm like, okay, so I think one of the big lessons is that the apostles, what's the lesson for the apostles? Because they're looking at this thing like, I'm tired. I'm exhausted. I've just worked for Jesus hardcore. I've been out for weeks on end. I've come back. I was excited, but I'm also kind of worn out. I don't even have time to eat. These crowds are pressing in. I'm just trying to get away and be with Jesus, and I can't get there. And when I try to go away and be with Jesus, the crowd just incessantly keeps coming. But somewhere in the course of the day, they had a sense of looking at the crowd and sharing the same compassion that Jesus had, sharing the same. I'm looking at these people and they're starving for God, but they're also starving. They need to eat. And what are we going to do about this? They see the problem that's existing. So they go to Jesus like, Lord, something's got to be done. Something needs to be done to fix this problem. And Jesus' response is, you fix it. Why don't you guys step up and fix it? To which they're like, we don't step up and fix it because like we got nothing. We don't have the money to do this, and we don't have the resources to do this, and the little tiny that we have is not enough to do anything. And Jesus is like, well, bring me the little tiny that you have. Bring me the little tiny that you have. You put it in Jesus's hands. Jesus blesses it, breaks it, hands it back, and it just keeps multiplying. It just keeps going until everybody's needs are met. And the guys who began the day with nothing walk away at the end of the day, each of them with a full basket of enough food to last them for quite some time. I think about this a lot and I look at this passage and I think, now, I'm not saying Jesus can't do this and isn't even doing this miracle in modern times. I've heard plenty of stories and read stuff, particularly on the mission field, of Jesus increasing food supplies in places where it was miraculous. There was no other word for it. But it's not common. That's why we call them miracles. What is the thing Jesus is saying to you and I? What is he trying to teach you and I? And I think he's saying, well, at least one thing he's saying. He's going to take care of your needs. He's going to take care of your hunger, your thirst, your most basic needs. He's concerned. He sees it. He cares about that, and he wants to meet that need on his terms. I think that when we take whatever gifts, talents, resources, skills, abilities that we have and hand them to Jesus and say, Lord, I got almost nothing, but I'll give you what I do have. And you take it and you can use it then to give thanks, break it and hand it back. And I'll just take the next step. For the next step, each apostle was the next step is I take this piece and I hand it to the next guy. And then the next guy, and then the next lady, and then on it goes until it just keeps going and going. There was a theologian, Frederick Bruckner, who was a Presbyterian theologian and author. And he's famous for this one statement he made. He's made a lot, but one of the statements he made was, the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's hunger meet. That's an interesting thought. Where your deep gladness and the world's hunger meet. Your joy of what you can contribute, what you can do with the little you have, and the compassion need that is being met in the world's hunger. When those two things meet, that's the place God's calling you to. So I think for us, we sit back and I think Jesus would be saying to us in the modern era, wherever you live, whatever town or city you live in, say, what do you see? For the apostles, they could see, oh, there's a crowd of people in the middle of nowhere in an isolated, lonely place without resources to get their food, and they're all going hungry. It's been a long day. They've gotten teaching, they've gotten healing, but it's been a long day, and I can see the need. What's the need where you live? I know of recently in my town, I was at a meeting, a bureaucratic meeting of city government, and saw the stats go out, and there was a huge issue of the rise of, even though opioid deaths are falling across America, they're rising here. I know that we have some of the highest cases of domestic violence anywhere in our state. I know that we have some poverty issues that are huge. I know that there are these big needs. What's the needs where you live? What do you see? When you look at the world around you in your community, in your town, what do you see? Because that's the beginning. And then I think the next question will be, what do you have? What do you have? And most of our responses are going to be, I got nothing, Lord. If you're asking me, when I see that need, when I hear of that problem, when I look at this big societal crushing thing that's going on, this great tragedy that's happening inside my town, and you look at me and say, well, what can you do about it? My answer is going to be nothing. I got nothing. I got no resources. I got no money, and I got no skills. I got no abilities to fix this. And Jesus would say, what do you have? What do you have? Because here's the truth. We all got something. We all got a skill. We all got a talent. We all got abilities. We all got something that we could use. And if we just could see the littlest something we have and say, Lord, this is what I can give. It just seems so, what is that amongst so many? Much like Andrew said, what is the little tiny thing I have against this huge amount of problem? And Jesus would say, give me what you got. Just give me what you got. You give it to me, and I'm going to hand it back to you. And you don't have to meet the great need. Just take the next step. And whatever the next step is, keep repeating that until I say quit. And I think what Jesus is telling us, that is the story of his gospel. His gospel is, I'll speak to you. You'll see the need. You'll bring me what you have. I'll multiply it in you. And you just keep going out. And remember, I had said this miracle would not have taken place if a bunch of people didn't participate. If a bunch of people didn't actively participate in the distribution of the food, this miracle wouldn't have happened the way it did. And Jesus, I think, is looking at this and saying, and the same in your situation. You start it, and you'll see I'll bring more. And more people will participate. And the more that happens, the bigger it gets. I have a study guide that's going to go with this, and I'll attach that to this. So I'm going to leave you with these two questions. What do you see around you where you live? What do you see? And then what do you have? And then begin asking, what if? What if I gave this to Jesus? What if I volunteered to do that? What if I let Jesus make me step forward with just the little thing? And then I think you'd begin to see the miracles taking place in your own life of huge change that could begin because you just simply gave Jesus what you did have. I'll tell you a story in my own life of when I saw and I looked at what I had and I asked Jesus, well, what if? What if? I'm pastoring this church in downtown Spokane, Washington, and it's sitting on the corner of the what is easily identified as the worst, most decadent, most homeless-driven, drug-addicted corner in our entire county. It is like it's actually synonymous. When we say second division, everybody all over our county go, "Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about. That's the worst of the worst place." Our church sat on second division, and I was very new to the church. I'd been there less than a year. And the senior pastor resigned, kind of leaving me holding the bag. I was the worship leader and the associate pastor, and I became the senior. And one day I'm driving down to church. I got my two teenage daughters with me. We're the worship team. I'm the preacher. There's hardly anybody serving in the church. We got like 40, 45 members maybe, and most of them are old, been in that church a long time. A few young people who'd been like children of the church, grew up here because my grandparents went here and they never thought of going anywhere else. And that particular Sunday, I had gotten sick, and I was like, had this laryngitis. I could not talk. And so I was like this. I couldn't talk at all. And we're driving down to church. My two daughters with me, and they're like, "Well, Dad, we can sing. You play guitar, we can sing, but what are you going to do for a sermon?" I'm like, "I don't know what I'm going to do." And so we got to church, and I prayed a little bit, and I had this idea. I I thought it would go nowhere, but like I'm telling you, we're on the worst of the worst corners now, mind you. And when we sang, they sang the worship. I played guitar. They sang. And then when we got to the very end of that section, I turned around and I stood up to the microphone and I said something to this effect. It was like, I can't talk today. I've got laryngitis. So here's what we're going to do. I want each of you to walk out of this church in the 40 minutes I would normally be preaching, and you're going to go asking anybody you find in the neighborhood if you can pray for them. And then you pray for them and come back in about 40, 45 minutes, and we'll just share our stories and go home. Okay. That's what I said. I didn't expect anybody to do this. Like, I'm thinking this is going to be a total bust. But they sit quietly for a second, and then one by one, first person gets up, then another. They walk out the back doors, they head outside till I'm left alone. Alone. Everybody went out. And I'm left alone with just one physically incapable person who couldn't walk, and one very old woman. And they're just praying. They're just got their heads bowed and they're praying. And I'm like, okay, let's see what happens. And about 40 minutes later, they start coming back, drifting in. And they got these beaming smiles on their face. And it's like, I don't know what's going on. And then they step up to the microphone, they start telling stories. And one says, yeah, I went out and prayed, and there was a burger joint across the street. And I went over there, and there was a cop car there. And I asked the cop if I could pray for them. And they said, absolutely. And she was having a rough day already. And so she prayed for this person. There were college students at the Starbucks on the other side of the street. And that Starbucks is gone now. They couldn't compete in the neighborhood. But at the time it was there, and they said there were some college students who were studying, and I asked if I could pray for them. And they said, that'd be great. We're taking a huge test. Would you pray? And other people walked the alleys and prayed for homeless people that were sleeping around our church and prayed for drug addicts. And it was interesting. And one of the old saints of the church, she came back to me and she said, I've been gone to this church my whole life. And at this time, she's in her late 70s. And she said, I never really saw this neighborhood before. I've been coming to church here. I just drive and go to church. I see the building. I never really looked at the neighborhood before. And I didn't know how bad it was. And my daughter, she came walking the door with a family in tow, a young guy and his girl, and they had three little kids, and brought them back to church because they had nowhere to go. They were living in their car. We would eventually perform a wedding ceremony for that couple who hung with us for a while, got them married. And we would send them off to reunite with family, and away they went. And I would write a book about this called Lessons from a Church in Zombieland, and I got some more fascinating stuff to say about that in the book. But what was interesting was at the end of the day, that old lady's phrase, I never saw the neighborhood before. For the first time, she saw. And then the question is, well, what can we do about this? What can we do with this huge drug addicted, drunken, at that time, heroin infested, needles left around our church, just the poverty and the crime, the difficulty? What can we do? We're just this broken down little church that can't even pay our own bills. And we're older people and a few youngsters. And we got nothing. And my wife and I sort of looked at, well, we don't have nothing. We have something. What do we have? And the answer is, well, we have this location. We have this building. There was a gymnasium, built in 1921, I think. And there was a little kitchen off to the side. It wasn't huge, but it had a little bit of commercial grade to it. Hadn't been used in years. And so my wife and I are like, well, we got a gym and we got a kitchen. So what if we just invited people in? And we had spent a lot of money trying to revamp our children's ministries. There was a big screen TV we'd put up to do children's videos and stuff. Children's ministry was a bust. Never worked out because, we had 44 registered sex offenders living within 8 blocks of the church. No joke. That children's ministry was never going to take off. It was a rough neighborhood. We said, well, what if we just opened up our gym on Monday night. We watched Monday Night Football and we just cooked chili and cornbread. We could do that. We could put together enough money for chili and cornbread. And so that fall, we opened, it was within probably a month of that prayer time when the church finally saw its neighborhood. We opened up our gym. And 35 homeless street addicts came that first night. I walked the back alleys with a little flyer and handed it to everybody I could see on every corner. Come and watch Monday Night Football with me, and free chili and cornbread. Only three rules: don't come high or drunk, be polite, don't ask for money. That they couldn't keep three rules. They could keep two rules: be polite, don't ask for money. They came high, they came drunk, but they were polite. That first night, 35 people came, and within a month, 150 were coming. And for the next 4 or 5 years, our church, while we lived on that corner, kept that meal going. Up to 200 people came every week. We shifted it to Sunday mornings, and we became known regionally in the area. We became known by the city council and the city government and our state representatives. And we got grants. Actually, we got some grants from the state and everything to keep our meal going. Because we could keep our meal going, we could pay the utility bills. And we used money from that to kind of keep things going. It was amazing how, when we were done, our baskets were full. And we used that reputation and those years of ministry to create even the ministry that we're doing now, what we have at the Gathering House in Spokane, Washington. Even the reputation we have and where we've gone all these years later is still built off that one time when I had laryngitis and we walked the neighborhood and for the first time saw the neighborhood. I had seen it because I was relatively new, but they hadn't seen it. What do you see and what do you have? And will you give it to Jesus at the smallest level and let him say, great, let me bless this, give thanks for it, hand it back to you, and let's see what happens next. In your own life, that miracle is waiting for you to look at what you see, look at what you have, and give it to Jesus.